All right, welcome to the study group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome, Kitty. Welcome, everyone at home. Today, we're going to be talking about Cain and Abel. And this was brought about because I was listening to Christian radio and just reflecting on how the Christian interpretation of Cain and Abel is so limited due to the information that they have. And my heart really went out to that community. And I felt that this was a good opportunity for us as Urantia Book readers to kind of uplift the quality of thinking and give us all back our origin, history, and destiny.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, this is a really interesting example of looking at what exists in the human record and then comparing it to the information we have in the Urantia Book. And we can see how there's echoes from the past of these stories that have come through the various written records that exist, the Bible being primary among them. But then we also discover how these stories have been, they hold the kernels of truth to some degree, but they've also been distorted for the purposes of the authors who made the modifications in the stories.
Yeah.
So in this case, they had records in Babylon that they discovered and used those, but then they had their own purposes in mind as well. So some of the details got modified. So we're going to be looking at what to us seems like a more accurate rendering of those days and what actually went on. So it's fascinating. I think you'll find it interesting regardless of how where your loyalties lie in terms of these different accounts. But this one's good for comparison, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just get started as far as where we're going to be talking about geographically.
Yeah, good idea.
So here we got a map here, and I'm just going to kind of fill you in on that. We're kind of here. I'm zooming into where the Urantia Book shows that the first Eden was in the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And what we'll get into some of these readings, and we'll even cover in a podcast about the default of Adam and Eve and the gardens.
Mm-hmm.
But just to give you an idea so that you know where we're talking about. So we're talking about the first Eden being off the eastern end of the Mediterranean. But the main part of the story that we're talking about today is covering the second Eden of where Cain and Abel grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in between the Tigris and the Euphrates, comparable to modern day Baghdad, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
And, in Iraq, right? And they say, even in the Bible, in between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But the Urantia Book gives us a deeper understanding of how this is the second garden location.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just for reference so everybody knows where we're talking about here. And we'll go back to it so you guys understand, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, well, just the main idea that there were two gardens. There was the first garden, and that's the one that Adam and Eve were compelled to leave. So then they took their crew with them to the second garden and reestablished the center of civilization there. And we won't get into the details of, we'll get into the details about,
podcast.
How that happened and why that happened in another podcast. But we're going to pick up the story around the issue. Pick up the story in the second slide, I guess, but where they're going from the first garden to the second garden. But before that, we have these comments from the Urantia Book about the story in the Bible and how the scribes, when they were transcribing this, made some little mistakes, a big mistake in what they were intending to do, and left in a very important detail.
Yeah, and you'll see kind of a common pattern that in the hubris that comes from mass editing. Sometimes you just leave in these details that just kind of blow it wide open.
Right.
As we
it's
find
what?
Cain going to the land of Nod to get himself a wife. So let me just get started here.
Yeah, go for it.
So here on paper 148, Jesus is talking to the apostles, and he's talking to Thomas specifically. And he says, Thomas, why do you refuse to comprehend the meaning of the record which discloses how Cain, the son of Adam, went over into the land of Nod and there got himself a wife? And then in paper 74, they say that the earlier traditions recognized pre-Adamic civilization is clearly shown by the fact that later editors intended to eradicate all reference to human affairs before Adam's time, neglected to remove the telltale reference to Cain's immigration to the land of Nod, where he took himself a wife. So if we want to look at the map here, this is where the land of Nod is. It's directly east of Eden.
The second Eden.
Of the second Eden into what is modern day Iran.
Right. So these writers they're talking about, we're trying to establish the story that Adam and Eve were the first humans. That was their intention.
Right.
But then they left in this detail about how Cain went over to the land of Nod, which clearly indicates that there was a pre-Adamic civilization.
Right.
Which is very important to understand if we're going to get a grasp on the real meaning of these events.
Right, right. And that's why the Urantia Book supports this understanding of ancient history that we all have been kind of hinting at, even the ancient astronaut theorists or whatnot. But
yeah,
the Urantia Book kind of gives us our story back.
Right. And that's one of the functions of revelation, at least as they explain it in the Urantia Book, is to fill in the missing pieces in our past, in our story of, what's gone on this planet. So we're grateful for that because it brings coherence, a higher level of coherence to our understanding.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let me get into this next quote. This is just kind of placing us as to where we're working from, and that Jesus was privy to this understanding as well. So now we're going to go into the Urantia Book in paper 76, where it says, Cain was born before the Adamic caravan had reached its destination between the rivers of Mesopotamia. So that line that I showed, and I'll show you again, of that migration from the first Eden to the second Eden.
Yeah, and it took them about a year for this huge group of people to make that migration. And along the way, Cain was born. So he was conceived in the first garden. And that all the events around his conception were what forced Adam and Eve to leave.
Yeah, so you see where they went.
So along the way, Cain was born.
And
mid-journey, so
right,
to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
And as well as his stepsister, Sansa, which we'll get into. There's a lot of offshoots from this story, but we've chosen to start here.
Yeah.
And we'll continue on with these. So, okay, with the next quote, it says, less than 2 years after Cain's birth, Abel was born, the first child of Adam and Eve to be born in the second garden. So as they migrated to that garden, that's when Abel was born. When Abel grew up to the age of 12 years, he elected to be a herder. Cain had chosen to follow agriculture. So we understand that the culture of the first Eden was more of agricultural based. And we'll get into the reasons why some of the spiritual practices might have reflected more of the sacrificial thing at that time.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me get into this next quote. In paper 76, it says, the two boys had many times argued about the relative merits of their vocations, and Abel was not slow to note that preference was shown for his animal sacrifices. In vain did Cain appeal to the traditions of the first Eden, to the former preference for the fruits of the fields.
Right. So this change is going on in the culture in the second garden. It's kind of reverting back to earlier stages. And Cain, unfortunately, was more loyal to the earlier tradition. Yeah. But in the second garden, they weren't able to keep that up. So Abel, well, we'll see about that in the next slide. But maybe you want to go on to the next one.
Yeah. So paper 76 continues. Adam was burdened with 1,001 details associated with the work of building, defense, and agriculture. Being much depressed spiritually, he entrusted the organization of worship and education to those of Nodite extraction who had served in these capacities in the first garden. And in even so short a time, the officiating Nodite priests were reverting to the standards and rulings of pre-Adamic times. So they went backwards
Right.
to those animal sacrifice rituals as opposed to the agriculture.
Right.
Okay.
And here again, we're talking about the Nodites, who
Right.
was this other civilization that pre-existed the first garden.
Right. When we talk about the land of Nod.
Right. So that's what these are all references to this other group of people who were already here when the first garden was established. So they played various roles and got involved with the work of the first garden. And some of them were loyal to Adam and followed him to the second garden. So these are the people they're talking about here.
Yeah. And we can't wait to get into that, all that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
You know,
No, it's
talk about
fascinating.
the development of the Garden of Eden and Van and Abaddon and the rebellion
Right.
and all that stuff. So we'll get into it more. But
yeah, so these Nodites had prior traditions.
right.
And they're saying that they were reverting to these prior traditions because Adam was so caught up in building the second garden. They had to break ground from scratch in the second garden.
You're right. The first garden was prered for them by Van and others.
Yeah.
The second garden was from the sweat of their face. They
Right.
had to develop it.
And just, so let's
All
see.
right. So you want to read a quote here?
Sure. Let me go ahead with the next one. So continuing the story, here they say that the two boys never got along well in this matter of sacrifices. Which sacrifices were better, the animal sacrifices or the offering of the fruits of the fields, further contributed to the growing hatred between them. Abel knew he was the son of both Adam and Eve, and never failed to impress upon Cain that Adam was not his father. So that's also part of the story.
This is a big important
thing
detail,
that we'll get into later, but that's so important to remember here. Adam was not the father of Cain. And all of this, with Cain's natural bellicose inheritance, caused him to nourish an ever-increasing hatred for his younger brother. The boys were respectively 18 and 20 years of age when the tension between them was finally resolved one day when Abel's taunts so infuriated his bellicose brother that Cain turned upon him in wrath and slew him. So this is sort of like the story
in the Bible,
in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So you can see we're picking up pieces of it.
Yeah, let's continue the story then.
So here we go, continuing on. Abel, especially during his younger years, was greatly influenced by his unfavorable surroundings. So here we're talking about having to build in the second garden and this long trek of a year's time, just everything that was going on. He didn't get the attention he probably should have had from his parents.
It was a challenging environment.
It was very challenging, and that's what they mean by unfavorable surroundings. It was a very challenging time. He would have become an entirely different person had he lived to be 25 or 30. His superb inheritance would then have shown itself. Right. So being the child of Adam and Eve, he had this very high inheritance, but it was being suppressed because of the conditions. The death of Abel became known to his parents when his dogs brought the flocks home without their master. To Adam and Eve, Cain was fast becoming a grim reminder of their folly, and they encouraged him in his decision to leave the garden. So this folly involved Eve becoming pregnant by someone else besides Adam, and Cain was the result of that. So that's what disrupted the whole first garden enterprise.
Right, yeah.
But we'll get more.
We'll get into that in the future. We'll talk about...
But just to know that this was an issue between Cain and Abel. Their difference in parentage also contributed to their conflict.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, the Bible, it being limited in some of the content that it has, Christians have a tough time, and perhaps Jews, discerning this stuff.
Yeah.
But that's why we're so appreciative of the Urantia Book really giving us this insight, this really important insight, because in the Bible it talks about that both Cain and Abel were the children of Adam and Eve. But here the Urantia Book reveals why there was animosity between them, because they had different fathers. Caino being the father of Cain.
Right.
Right.
Right. And he was a Nodite.
Who was a Nodite, yeah.
Right. Okay. Should I pick up here?
Yeah.
So going on with the story here, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think. But Cain knew. So Cain was saying, okay, I want to get out of here. I'm not happy here. And his parents were encouraging him to leave, right? But Cain knew that since he bore no tribal mark, he would be killed by the first neighboring tribesman who might chance to meet him. This is sort of the way things were in those days. If you weren't part of a tribe,
Yeah.
Fear and some remorse led him to repent. He now went to Eve, his mother, and asked for spiritual help and guidance. And when he honestly sought divine assistance, an adjuster indwelt him. And you may know from our other podcasts, when the Urantia Book talks about adjusters, they're talking about a spirit of God that lives within us. So an adjuster came and indwelt him. And this adjuster, dwelling within and looking out, gave Cain a distinct advantage of superiority, which classed him with the greatly feared tribe of Adam. So what they're saying here, as I understand it, is having a spirit of God indwelling you changes your countenance. It changes your appearance. It gives you a presence.
Yeah,
and
presence.
And a power in your presence that in his case made him
revered,
comparable to the Adamites who had this.
And I think this is important because this is another place where the Bible and the Christians kind of, unfortunately, don't have enough information to work with. And so they call the mark of Cain being almost like the mark of the beast, or this very kind of dark.
Something negative.
Yeah, it's a negative thing that creates this negative influence throughout the planet. And fortunately, the Urantia Book gives us these details that the mark of Cain is, what did they say? The mark of Adam. And what is that? A thought adjuster.
Right.
So he was indwelt with the particle of God that we're all indwelt with. And it's so beautiful to think about how it was his mother, Eve, who supported that.
Right.
And how in our experiences, it's our celestial mother, Mother Spirit, and the Holy Spirit that supports our enlightenment into God's indwelling as well.
Yeah, and in spite of the fact that he had killed her son,
right,
which is, some pretty serious business, when he was sincerely asked for forgiveness and was afraid of what was going to become of him, she had compassion for him. And because of that, he was then given this great gift that allowed him to survive when he left the garden, because otherwise he would have been killed right away.
Yeah. Okay, well, you want to read that last quote
so
about that?
Then we see the outworking of this, where they say, and so Cain departed for the land of Nod, east of the second garden, as recorded in the Old Testament. He became a great leader among one group of his father's people. So his father was a Nodite. So these are the people living east of Eden. He became a great leader among one group of his father's people and did, to a certain degree, fulfill the predictions of Sympathetic. And Sympathetic we'll learn about later. He was the one who was encouraged this change of plans that led to Eve.
What might be known as the serpent in the garden. Sympathetic, the serpent.
Right, exactly. But even Sympathetic had positive intentions. He thought this was a good idea, right? So they're saying that to some degree, Cain did fulfill the predictions of Sympathetic, for he did promote peace between this division of the Nodites and the Adamites throughout his lifetime. Cain married Ramona, his distant cousin, and their first son, Enoch, became the head of the Elamite Nodites. And for hundreds of years, the Elamites and the Adamites continued to be at peace. And this is significant because there had been great warfare between the Adamites and the Nodites because of what happened that, broke down the first garden. There's tremendous animosity between these two groups. But they're saying in this case, this group of Nodites found themselves in peaceful relations with the Adamites.
Yeah, if you look on the map here, you see where the land of Nod is just east of Eden. And that's where Cain migrated to.
Right.
And then that's where he bore his first son with Ramona, Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
And what we'll see in the future and what we'll talk about maybe in the next podcast is Enoch.
You're right, who he was.
Yeah, who was Enoch? What did he do? And how maybe he was interpreted falsely, as we see coming down in this, as things were so en masse edited, as the Urantia Book tells us. Things were a little twisted.
I think there's even 2 different Enochs, right?
Yeah, we'll get into it. We'll get into it. We don't want to confuse you too much, but yeah.
If not more.
Yeah.
But
so this is an interesting opportunity to just kind of take another look at Cain and Abel, and in particularly for me to take another look at Cain and see that he did bring peace between the Nodites and the Adamites. His offspring did that.
Yeah.
And a lot of value, as we'll get to find out about his offspring, was the first one to fuse on this planet.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of goodness that came from the line of Cain, as opposed to how we're always looking for that evilness.
Yeah, well, Cain turns out to be a much more sympathetic character than we might otherwise suspect.
Right.
And he was subjected to a lot of unfortunate pressures and, the whole conflict with his brother and just everything about it bore down on him in a way that was not his fault.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe he got out of control when he killed his brother. That's not a good thing. But otherwise, we can begin to see him in a much more sympathetic light. And that he ended up playing a very significant role. Yeah.
And hopefully maybe this gives inspiration to be a little bit more sympathetic with one another.
Yeah.
That we're here on this rebellion planet. Maybe it's not that easy, man.
And we all come from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Just like with them, sometimes different backgrounds, it just carries an animosity along with it that's really unnecessary. Yeah. So we hope to grow out of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
As they say that Abel would have if he lived a little longer. He would have shown his true inheritance.
Yeah, and I think that's something that maybe we could talk about in the future, about where the Urantia Book talks about the evolution of the thought adjuster's influence in people.
Right.
And why maybe so many talented people leave us so early.
Yeah. That's a whole sad thing, too.
Yeah.
But just one last detail. In those days, thought adjusters weren't bestowed universally. Now they are. So everyone has the Spirit of God living within them. Pretty much. Everyone that doesn't reject it. But in those days, that wasn't the case. So it was a big deal that Cain got one. Yeah, was given this spirit gift, and that transformed him and uplifted him.
Right on. Well, may you all be baptized in the Holy Spirit.
Right, indeed.
Right on. Well, great job, Chuck. This was a fun one to do. Thanks, everybody at home. If you have any more suggestions for maybe some famous Urantia Book people in the past, drop a comment and let us know.
Yeah. Right. And questions from the Bible compared to the Urantia Book. We're trying to be fair and develop and expand our understanding of what's in the Bible. Yeah. Not so much to negate it, but to grow it and make it more meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's our hope here.
Yeah. All right, man. Well,
okay.
God bless y'all. See you next time.
All righty.